So, thank you for showing up to everyone. This is a lit review paper, and it's rather late, so hopefully this won't be too boring of a talk. I've tried to put in a lot of examples here to sort of keep it a bit more engaging, considering we're late in the evening or in the afternoon. The paper that I will present today is sort of a truly collaborative effort together with my colleagues from Center for Digital Creativity at Aarhus University, Lindsay, MacDonald, Vermeulen, Remy, Mose, Biskjaer, and Peter Dalsgaard. And I can't really take all the credit for this because this is something that we've been working on for a very long time, and we've put a lot of hours into this, each and every one of us. During the past 30 years or so, computers and digital tools have been playing an ever-increasing role in almost all aspects of our life. This is not least true for creative activities, whether they be young children expressing themselves using a tablet for making fanciful drawings, or professional creatives such as graphic designers, architects, or music producers, for which InDesign's 3D modeling software or Logic Pro X are essential tools. Digital tools for creativity support are often referred to as creativity support tools within the literature, and that's the term that I'll be using throughout the rest of the presentation. So, it's previously been shown that this trend of addressing creativity-related research within HCI is also growing. This is an increasing interest for the field of HCI. Also, relatively speaking, the number of publications is growing, but relatively speaking, the number of HCI publications addressing creativity is also increasing, or is increasing relatively more. And generally speaking, the CSTs developed they're quite diverse in the sense that they address a lot of different aspects, and they run on different devices and such. So we might have an example like this motif, which is a super cool smartphone-based video recording and editing tool that supports novice videographers' creativity through expert heuristics. Over the Inspiration Wall, which is an exciting CST intended to run on larger displays that leverages speech recognition to enhance an ongoing collaborative ideation session by automatically retrieving and presenting stimuli related to the conversation. Or another recent very cool creativity support tool, the Critique Kit, which leverages interactive guidance to improve feedback on creative work. So, this very diverse landscape we've tried to provide a characteristic of. And what I'm going to present today is only a snapshot of some of those characteristics. And you can obviously look more in the paper, but this is sort of the very broad overview of the landscape at the moment. We sampled 443 of the most influential creativity support tools out there. We did it using citations as a proxy for influence. And in case you're wondering, it took quite a long time to read all of these papers. And we qualitatively coded them in 8 different categories, and this coding was done by 3 individual coders, myself as one of them. And we have structured the results in 3 different areas. This is, so one of the byproducts of doing this type of reviewing is that we ended up with a very, very comprehensive coding scheme, which you could, I guess, refer to as sort of a taxonomy for creativity support tools. You can find this in the paper. I'm only going to be talking about some of the aspects here today, but yes. This is one of the byproducts that we are actually quite happy about with this paper, but it doesn't really fit well in a presentation like this. So I'm going to highlight 3 findings. The first one is in terms of the creativity support tools themselves. The second is insights on the findings or the research on the creativity support tools, and finally I'll talk a bit about future directions for this type of work. So, first of all, the creativity support tools. Looking at the device that these tools are designed to be used on, we can see that the laptop or the PC is by far the most popular device to design for when designing and developing CSTs. A good example of this would be this Idea Hound, which is a very cool CST intended for that integrates the task of defining semantic relationships among ideas into the primary task of actually doing the idea generation itself. And the second largest group of devices supported is this miscellaneous, which doesn't really tell you much, but basically it contains specially built hardware in some cases, often in conjunction with laptop PCs or existing sort of commercially available tools. And a very good example of this is this nice polyphony, which integrates interactive paper and stylus type input devices to make a more fluid to enable a more fluid transition between informal sketches and more formal computer-based representations of music compositions. Surprisingly enough, at least to us, there's quite a lot of tangibles out there, or tangible user interfaces out there to support creativity support. And a nice little example of that is this Naruhodo button, which means something like, I see, in Japanese. And it's a simple and quite cool way of sort of the physical equivalent of the Facebook like button that seeks to mitigate evaluation apprehension during sort of face-to-face brainstorming. So one of the things that also surprised us is that there are very, very few smartphone-based creativity support tools. And one of the very, very good examples of such a tool could actually be the Story Kit, which I believe is still available on the App Store today. And it's an authoring tool that helps, that uses the media capturing components of a smartphone to enable rich story composition for children in the wild. Yes. So if we move on to another sort of description of the creativity support tools, we try to code for complexity. And obviously complexity can mean a lot of things. But the first here, low complexity, we mean one or two single feature for a very clearly defined and explicit use case. And an example of this could be Aquamarine, which is a very powerful tool that does one thing very, very well. And it provides an alternative to this linear undo model. You probably know, if you've ever done something with Photoshop or something like that if you undo, it's always going to be linear. This actually provides an alternative to this model, and as such, it does a very little thing, but very, very well. Medium complexity means several features supporting several activities, but still within a somewhat sort of defined use case. And a recent example of this is Inject, which is a sidebar for the Google Docs for journalists, and it supports concurrent ideation and exploration of articles during the writing process. So while you're writing, you sort of explore new takes on the story that you're working on. And finally, we have a limited amount of like highly complex creativity support tools. And a canonical example of this is this Island from 1999. Which almost reflects the Wysian dream of using wall-sized displays and tabletops and personal computers and tablets and so on. Yes. So that was very briefly about the tools themselves. Now I'll talk a bit about the research on the tools. And one of the things that we looked at is what part of the creative process is actually supported by these creativity support tools. But to do so, we needed a rough outline for the creative model. And this is just basically a very basic sort of mapping of the creative process with 4 steps: pre-ideation, idea generation, implementation, and evaluation. And then during the coding, we realized that we also needed a couple of meta steps, or something that doesn't really fit into this linear creative process, or model of the creative process. And in this case, we have iterations, so tools that support the actual going over several iterations of the creative process, or managing or planning the process as it unfolds. Perhaps unsurprisingly, idea generation and implementation, and to some degree also evaluation, is relatively well supported. I've already talked about tools such as IdeaHound or Naruhodo, which are obviously for ideation, and this Aquamarine, or Polyphony, which could be considered tools for implementing creative work. So I wanted to sort of provide you with an example of something that would be considered pre-ideation. And an example of such a CST might be this Momentum, which is a tool that before you enter the ideation session, you elicit some topic-oriented responses that you then want to be prompted for during the ideation session. So something that helps you structure before this ideation part. And another rare example of one of the two meta levels, in this case iteration, is Metamorph, which is a framework for exploring many different alternatives that allows for a more sort of flexible iteration over three-dimensional design models. So that's a bit on the part of the creative process here. Finally, most of the CSTs that we reviewed, they are currently inaccessible to researchers or the public, meaning that the URL provided in the paper yields a 404, or it basically isn't there anymore. And if you Google search for the name of the tool, you can't really find it anywhere online. So that's also sort of a by-finding of doing, or one of the sort of partial findings of doing such a review. If I then move to some of the future directions or points for discussion for future directions, is probably what they are. One of the things that I kind of want to highlight here is that since that most of the CSTs out there are low complexity or medium complexity and they support ideation. But then how can we and then sort of one of our questions is, how do we then best take in the level of expertise for some of the target users into account when studying these CSTs? For example, do we need to adjust our evaluation methods to include more of creative professionals, or do we need to consider the use of more complex creativity support tools? Because arguably there's a big difference between, let's say, Adobe Photoshop, which has hundreds of different features, and then a low or medium complexity creativity support tool. And also, a lot of the idea generation actually unfolds concurrently while you're implementing or evaluating or working on the thing that you're actually producing, which, to be fair, is supported by a tool like Inject, but most of the tools have sort of a very distinct division of the phases in the creative process. Additionally, most of the CSTs are, as I just mentioned, unavailable, and this might be obvious if the tools were special built hardware that doesn't really scale. But as showed on one of the very first slides, they're built for tablets and for desktop computers, and so it's basically software, most of it. And this could be made available with very little effort. And considering that, then we sort of asked the question that then how can we make it easier to build on previous research, or even sort of support this trickle down of some of the more novel or experimental creativity support tools to sort of be picked up by the creative professionals and the communities out there who, I hope, are willing to sort of experiment with different tools out there. So those are some of the points for discussion. I will thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Lots of questions. Yeah. I can see that we have 4 or 5 questions, so yeah. If you could please keep your questions fairly short.
Okay. Yeah, so I wonder if you were able to kind of reflect on how these tools narrow down a little bit the creative task, meaning how they define it, or how, even more so than defining it, how they define the actions that people do, and how does that by definition, narrow it down versus allow for more? Or is that part of your analysis?
So
as such?
if I understand your question correctly, you're asking for sort of the idea of what is the creative activity.
Yeah. What I have in mind is that, in a way, when we define what the task is, we kind of narrow it down and based on something that is a little smaller than what it is. So I'm always a little cautious about CSTs in that sense. And I wonder if you looked at that in the systems you have.
I wouldn't say directly, but in some sense we did, because a lot of the CSTs consider at least the magic of creativity as something that happens when you get the idea. So that's maybe a partial answer to your question, that getting the idea or getting the right or the good idea is actually the creative magic that happens.
And that always happens when you're front of the device?
No, not necessarily, but obviously that might be a consequence of sort of designing for that specific situation. That's all you see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please raise your hand. We have a ton of questions, so we'll take 2 or 3 more questions, and then I'll ask you to go and talk to yourself.
Hi, Rebecca Fiebrink from Goldsmiths. First of all, thanks so much for doing this work. I think you've made a nice resource that I hope to share with students. I had a comment, and I'm curious how you would respond to this. So certainly what you've done here says something about the landscape of CSTs out there that researchers have been making, but I would argue that it actually says quite a lot about the kinds of CSTs that people choose to publish at CHI and other related ACM venues. And, personally, when I'm making something that's very complex, I don't tend to submit it to CHI because I don't have the confidence that reviewers are going to be familiar enough with the specific domain to, understand what I'm saying in a fairly short paper. And so I'm might question some of the general stats that you mentioned today. So curious what you have to say.
No, that is a very, very good point. We also use the average citation as a cutoff point to sort of crop down, basically, the amounts of CSTs that we look for. So these are the CSTs that people are most engaged in. And I mean, you could propose a hypothesis that people cite the easiestly understandable tools, if that makes sense.
Very much. Yeah.
So I think you have a very good point there.
Thank you. More questions? We have what? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, very related to that, it seems to me that, right, what is easily isolatable is that's where the creativity happened, which is ideation, is that's what gets designed for and that's what gets published on. So related to that, have you seen any way of, in your taxonomy, in the implementation, where arguably the overwhelming amount of creative work happens, lots of adaptive reasoning, lots of having ideas and trialing out during the process of making, to sort of, in your taxonomy, to zoom into that and to identify subtypes of that, or to identify little interventions in that, in something like, they're using Word and Excel, but as part of their creative process, a lot of the making happens in those kind of sub-processes, or as part of the work.
That's a very good idea. I think I'll have to look into that, now that you mention it. Thank you.
We have time for one more quick question over here on the front row. I know that there are more of you, but we also need to make time for the following papers.
Hi. I wanted to ask about if you can talk about any design directions more specific to tangible CSTs.
I think you would have to come and see me afterwards for that, to be honest. Thank you.
Okay, let's give Jonas another round of applause.